In this brief Lightroom tutorial, I want to show you how I took this picture and edited it to look like this. Let's begin. I always begin in my basic panel. Now this image on import had a preset applied to it. I've reset it back to straight out of the camera default Lightroom import settings. And I'm just going to work my way down through the basic panel. The first thing that I almost always do is increase the exposure. Now if you're watching this and you've shot the stars before, you'll notice that this is a very blue image. It was actually shot on tungsten. If you put it on auto, you can see that you can get a much more kind of starry night sky, less blue image. I like the tungsten look. Maybe it's a little too much here, so I'm going to back it off a tiny bit, but that's one of the rare times in camera where I shoot on something other than auto white balance, because I want to see on the back of the camera closer to what it's going to look like after I've edited it. All right, I come back down and finish my increasing my overall exposure. I think right around there looks pretty good. I almost always add a little bit of contrast, just kind of, again, make those stars pop from the background. Highlights, that's the stars in the Milky Way, so I'm going to increase that. That looks good. Shadows, in this case, I want a little bit more detail from the foreground and in the darker areas of the image, so I'm going to bring those shadows up a little bit as well. Whites I'm also going to bring up. Those are really those pinpoint bits of light. If we hit the J key, we can see lots of little red that shows where we're so bright we've lost exposure. Of course, there's no detail in the stars, so I'm okay with that. But I'm going to go ahead and bring them up a little bit more. And then the blacks, this is a fairly noisy image. It was shot at ISO 2500. You can see some noise in the sky. You can see some noise in the shadows. And one of the easiest ways to hide that is to bring those darker areas back down. So we're not even in the noise reduction yet, but I'm just going to decrease the blacks, and that's going to hide the noise for us. Clarity, in this case, I think 20 or 25 looks pretty good. Vibrance, just a little kick to help bring up some of those more muted colors. Saturation, maybe, but I don't think so. I'm going to leave saturation at 0. So that's my basic panel. I've made my changes here. And one of the things that looks like to me is this image is leaning just a little bit to the right. There's a couple of different ways to fix that. We can go in the crop tool, and of course we can just grab and drag, eyeballing the horizon in that overlay guide. Remember, if you hit O, you can change those guidelines that appear. I do like the very small tight grid as it helps visualize this the best. Now this was shot with a very wide angle lens, 15 millimeters on full frame. So even though I've straightened it, it still doesn't feel perfectly straight, and these trees are leaning more than I want. So I'm going to leave that as it is for a moment and come down to transform and go to my guided tool. And so now I'm going to draw a line across this horizon as straight as possible, saying that should be straight. And I'm going to pick one of these tall, straight trees. Trees almost always grow very tall and straight. There are exceptions, but in this case, I know that those on the bank there were growing tall and straight. And now I've straightened that, but you can see I've lost part of my image. So I'm just going to say constrain crop. It's going to fix that. And I realize that if I show this on Instagram, it can't be this tall. So I'm going to shrink my aspect ratio down to an 8.5 by 10. And jumping around a little bit, but I think right there is a nice compromise. That's more than I want. Why isn't it giving me everything I see here? There we go. So we've got a nice amount of leading foreground, that slick low tide beach with some of that reflection. And this seems like this feels straight to me, and it's a nice aspect ratio. Actually, maybe come back up just the smallest amount, somewhere around there. Nope, too much. So just eyeballing it. I'm pretty picky about my images being straight. All right, now we've made our overall changes. At this point, I'm ready to make some more selective adjustments. I'd really like to bring out this kind of beautiful reflection that was happening down here in the foreground. So I'm going to get my gradient tool, my linear gradient, and I'm just going to drag up from the bottom. This tool allows you to make adjustments over a smaller area of your image. And I'm just going to make sure that it's straight by holding over the middle line, grab it out near the edge, drag up, and I have that. But I don't want the temp to change. I do want the exposure to change. I want it to be a little bit brighter under there. A little more contrast. Bring those highlights up a little bit more. Kind of emphasizes that reflection. Bring the shadows down in this case. Similar to what I did in the star field, except in this case I am lowering the shadows, and I'll bring the blacks down. Ooh, just a touch. You can see that it gets pretty touchy pretty quick. That might be a very gentle difference right about there. Add a little bit of clarity and also a little bit more noise reduction. Now this is a reflection down in the foreground. It's wet, it's sand and beach, so I feel like I can really up the noise reduction in this area and get away with it. So it looks pretty good. I might even decrease the sharpness a little bit and see what I think. Actually, I think we want to go this way with this sharpness. So I'm just eyeballing the results. I just wait a second for it to preview. No, we'll go down just a little bit. It looked better there. Now, one other thing that we could discuss here, I've left them in at this point, is these driftwood logs on the beach are catching a good bit of the starlight, and there's actually just a tiny hint of moonlight as it was about to set. Those lit up, and I'm okay with that. I think it creates kind of an interesting division, and it's a little bit reflected here. There's this one right here, though, that the vertical is the only one that catches my eye. So I'm going to get my clone stamp tool, and I'm just going to take that out real quick. Do that. And also, I don't like this one star reflection that's right at the edge. Kind of draws the eye away. I'd like to keep people in more. So those are a couple quick tips. And now we got to work on the Milky Way. So I'm going to get my individual brush tool. I'm going to increase my exposure a little bit, my highlights a little, and my whites a little. And at this point, this is not doing anything at all because I haven't brushed on my image. Maybe a little bit more clarity and a tiny bit more saturation. I'm going to check my flow. That's how fast I want this effect to be applied as I paint it. And I'm going to increase that up maybe about 80. And I'm just going to come over here to the Milky Way and paint. And you can see that my temp has been messed with, so I'm going to fix that and maybe even move it to the right a little bit. So it just kind of brightens that area here. And here I'm just painting this on the Milky Way just to get it to stand out a little bit more, and it actually helps to be a little sloppy with your painting. It looks a little bit more natural, and maybe I'll just kind of continue that down in the reflection as well. If I hold down the Alt key, that painting brush turns into an erasing brush, and I can check my flow is lower for the erase. I can actually turn auto mask off in this case, and I can just kind of erase to really help define that beautiful definition that the Milky Way has. So I just want to make sure I did not paint in any of these darker parts. I want to emphasize that difference in that detail between the lighter. If I let go of the Alt key, I'm back to my regular brush, and I can brush on a little bit more, use my bracket key to change the size up or down. Maybe a little bit more up into this area and here as well. Looks pretty good. I'm going to close that. If you want to see what changes you just made in that brush tool, you can turn it off. Pre, post. Pre, post. Fairly subtle. I often watch this small thumbnail view over here on the left. It really kind of helps my eye see anything that might be more noticeable than I want. It's so funny how that works. This view at that size seems to me to be a very good overall view, even better than this big one staring you in the face at what's going to kind of stand out and catch your eye. And one thing I see change is a little bit more, too much. I might have overdone it over here. So I'm going to hit the Alt key, and I'm just going to back off some of that outer bits there. Actually, I don't think it was actually. So now let me do it again. All right. Just a little bit. And again, turn it off, back on, watching that area over there. Just going to whoopsie. I meant to hold down Alt. Just erasing that a little bit more. And of course, you can always hit O actually seem to have started a new brush. That's the issue. Let's get this one. Okay, now O shows you I can hold down Alt and erase a little bit here. Just a little bit. Tapping O again turns that brush strokes off so you can see exactly what you've done. Nice. Now the edges are a little bit darker than I like, so I'm going to come down to lens correction. There isn't a profile for this lens, so in manual, one of the things I'm going to battle is the vignetting that's happening in the top left and right corners. So I'm just going to drag this off to the right, watching those corners get brighter. I much prefer using the vignetting here in lens correction when you need to actually correct vignetting to brighten the corners. If there's also a vignette in the effects panel right here, but that really very quickly turns your image into something you don't want. So I really only use this to make my images darker when I want to emphasize my subject. But in this case, I really want an even from edge to edge, corner to corner view of my frame. So that was in the lens correction panel, vignetting. Distortion, I said there was a little bit of bowing, but I think we got rid of that with the cropping tool. You could, or sorry, the guided transform tool. You could play around with this a little bit and see if you got something that seemed a little bit straighter to you and less bowed. Actually, maybe. Let's do a -2. Again, that's really only necessary if you're shooting with a wider angle lens. All right, pretty happy with this. The last thing that I want to do, and this should also often be your last step, is a little bit of sharpening and noise reduction. A little bit of sharpening can really make those stars stand out. But as you sharpen, you can see this little preview here. This is just randomly sampling from somewhere. We could just tell it to give us any place else by clicking the little target indicator and clicking on the image. You can see that it gets quite noisy. I've left these other settings default, but down here in the luminance, I'm going to increase that to about 20. And you can see that some of that noise has now vanished. Down here, the detail, I think looks pretty good. But you know, depending on what ISO you shot it at and what camera sensor you're working with, you might want to just kind of move it from one side to the other and see what happens. But the 50 works pretty well for me. Contrast, I've often left at 0 as well, but we can bring that up and see if we get a little bit more reduction. I don't think it's enough to batter with. Down in the color, so this is removing those kind of odd bits of noise that you might get in a longer exposure. With the sensor heats up a little bit, you'll get some reds and you'll green in there as well. So I'm going to bring that up to maybe about 40. And my detail, I usually like to bring down to about half of my color. And if we want to see what it looked like before, we can turn this off. And you can see there's a good bit of color noise in there. And we didn't actually even see that at the very beginning because by default the detail panel is on with some sharpening and some noise reduction by default. But if we turn this on now, we can see that those are nicely taken out and the image just looks a little bit smoother without eating too many stars. That's the careful line we're walking between reducing some of the noise, but you don't want to reduce any of the stars. And that's it. That's what I've done to my star image. I think it brings it in much closer to this one. Let's see if I got close to that. This one actually still looks a little bit noisy to me, so I think I did not increase the noise quite as much. But I'm pretty happy with this shot. I might actually reduce the noise down here. It might look a little too much now, but overall, I'm pretty happy with this shot. I hope this was helpful to you. Thank you so much for your support. And if you have any questions, you can post them in the Lightroom support group. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.